On a far-off military station, the halls echoed with the sounds of drills, commands, and the sharp crack of discipline. Inside one of the largest chambers, predator cubs were being pushed through training that was unlike anything gentle or encouraging. The alien instructors in charge believed that the only way to shape the young cubs into fierce warriors was through strict and merciless methods. Every action was measured, every mistake punished, and every moment turned into a test of fear. The cubs, though young and full of untamed energy, were treated as if they were already soldiers of war. Their claws scraped against the metal floors as they moved in circles, their breaths heavy, eyes glowing in the dim, artificial lights. Instead of building their courage, the harsh training seemed to crush their spirit little by little. The instructors shouted commands with voices that carried no kindness, only the cold edge of authority. They cared little about the cubs' natural instincts or the bond that might have grown between them and their trainers. To them, breaking resistance was the first step toward creating obedience. Every lash of discipline, every raised hand, every harsh order was meant to mold the cubs into something unfeeling. But in the silence between the cracks of the whip and the roars of command, there was something else: fear. The cubs' small growls no longer sounded wild. They sounded wounded. Their eyes no longer reflected defiance. They showed submission. The training grounds, though meant to create strength, looked more like a place of shadows, where young lives carried the weight of cruelty. And yet, among the sharp edges of this place, there was a growing sense that something was about to change, something that would challenge the way this training had always been done. From the edge of the training hall, a human stood in silence, watching the harsh methods unfold with steady eyes. This person had been sent as an assistant to the program, someone the instructors hardly acknowledged, someone they believed was too soft, too fragile, and too inexperienced to truly understand what it meant to shape predator cubs into soldiers. The alien instructors had laughed quietly among themselves, whispering that a human's heart was filled with too much compassion to ever be useful here. To them, the human was an outsider, a simple observer who would soon turn away, unable to bear the sight of cruelty disguised as discipline. But the human did not look away. Instead, they studied every detail, every strike of the whip, every flinch of the cubs, every trembling growl that carried both fear and confusion. Where others saw weakness in the human's silence, something deeper was at work. Their eyes carried not just pity, but understanding, a recognition of the young cub's struggle. The human knew the difference between fear and respect, between broken obedience and true strength. Unlike the instructors who believed pain would shape warriors, the human understood that lasting authority was never born from cruelty, but from trust. The cubs noticed the human, too. Between commands and punishments, their glowing eyes flickered toward the quiet figure at the edge of the room. The human did not shout or threaten, yet there was something calm in their presence that stood out against the storm of harshness. They stood still, their hands folded, their gaze steady, as if silently telling the cubs that not all power needed to hurt. Though dismissed as unimportant, the human's arrival was already beginning to shift the balance in the room. Something unseen was building, a quiet strength that neither the cubs nor the instructors could yet put into words. The training chamber grew heavy with tension as the alien instructors shouted orders louder, their voices echoing against the metallic walls. The predator cubs, still young and confused, stumbled in their drills, their bodies shaking under the weight of exhaustion. Instead of patience, the instructors saw weakness. They believed strength could only be carved into the cubs through suffering, and so, without hesitation, they raised their whips high into the air. The sharp sound of the leather snapping against itself filled the hall, a cruel promise of what was about to come. Fear spread quickly among the cubs. Their glowing eyes widened, their claws scratched nervously at the ground, and low whimpers slipped past their teeth. They had known pain before, but each time the whips rose above them, the terror grew deeper, pressing into their hearts. The instructors saw the fear as progress, mistaking broken spirits for obedience. From the sidelines, the human observer's chest tightened. Every instinct screamed to intervene, but they held their ground for a moment longer, watching, understanding the danger of stepping too soon. The cub's gaze flickered again toward the human, almost begging silently for something, anything that wasn't cruelty. The raised whips hovered in the air, the silence before the strike louder than any command. The chamber seemed to hold its breath. It was in that moment the human realized this was not simply training. It was destruction. The instructors believed they were shaping warriors, but what they were truly creating was despair. The air quivered with the weight of what was about to happen, and though the instructors thought they were in full control, something unseen had already shifted. All eyes, both cubs and the quiet human, waited for the moment the whips would fall, and with it, the test of what true strength really meant. The chamber echoed with the sharp crack of whips striking the ground and the pitiful cries of predator cubs too small to defend themselves. Each sound dug deep into the human's chest, twisting like a blade, yet they remained standing in silence, their hands clenched tightly at their sides. The cubs tried to curl inward, their once proud stances shrinking as they flinched from every blow. Some pressed closer together for comfort. Others froze in place, their bodies trembling as if standing still might save them. The instructors moved with cold precision, their eyes fixed only on obedience, not on the pain etched across the young faces before them. Around the chamber, other onlookers stood quietly, some shifting uneasily, but none daring to speak. Their silence did not soften the cruelty, it made it louder. Every strike, every whimper, every shiver seemed to bounce off the walls and double in weight, until the air itself felt thick with suffering. The humans' breath grew shallow, their jaw tight as they struggled to remain only an observer. They knew they were surrounded by beings who believed this was the only path to strength. To challenge it meant defiance, and defiance carried risk. Still, the humans' gaze never wavered from the cubs. They saw not weakness, but the breaking of something sacred, the spirit that gave the young their courage. The instructors did not notice, but the cubs did. Between their fearful glances, their eyes sought the only figure in the room who had not turned away. The human stood in stillness, not in acceptance, but in witness. That quiet presence whispered to the cubs that cruelty was not all there was, that someone saw their suffering, and perhaps in time, someone would answer it. The sound of the whip slicing through the air was sharp enough to cut the silence, and when it landed just inches from a cub's face, the little one froze, its wide eyes brimming with terror. That single moment struck harder than any blow. The human's chest tightened until it felt like they could no longer breathe, and deep inside, something heavy gave way. They had watched long enough, endured long enough, and convinced themselves that staying silent was safer. But as the cub flinched, nearly losing balance from fear alone, the human knew there was no safety in silence anymore. Their hands unclenched, their posture straightened, and the quiet observer became something more. Heat rose in their chest, not from anger that burned recklessly, but from a steady fire of resolve. The cruelty before them was no longer training, it was the breaking of innocent lives. Their heart pounded, each beat demanding action. The instructors, still blind in their arrogance, raised their arms for another strike, not noticing the shift in the room. The cubs noticed first. Their gazes lifted toward the human, faint hope flickering where moments before there had only been despair. The human's breath steadied, their decision clear, carved into their very being. The weight of rules, of rank, of fear itself began to crumble under the force of that choice. Enough was enough. What stood in front of them was not discipline, not order, but cruelty dressed in authority, and it was something that could no longer be allowed to continue. The moment hung in the air, stretched tight, as if the universe itself paused, waiting to see if the human would act on the shift within. And though no words had yet been spoken, the silence before the storm carried its own undeniable power. The whip was frozen mid-air when the human's voice broke the silence. It was not a shout, not a plea, but a single word spoken with such steady strength that it carried more weight than any weapon. The sound rolled across the chamber like a wave, cutting through the harshness of cracking leather and frightened breaths. Every ear turned toward it, every eye shifted to the figure who had been silent for so long. Calm yet unshakable, the human stood tall, their presence suddenly commanding in a way that could not be ignored. The instructors hesitated, their arms held stiff, unsure if they had truly heard what they thought they did. The cubs, trembling only moments before, now clung to that word as if it were a shield. It wasn't the loudness that made it powerful, but the certainty, the tone that left no space for disobedience. In that instant, the human did not look fragile, did not look soft. They looked immovable, as if they had drawn an invisible line across the floor and dared anyone to cross it. The room, once filled with fear and cruelty, now carried the weight of authority born not from rank, but from truth. One command had shifted the balance. The air itself felt heavier, pressing on the instructors as their confidence faltered. They glanced at one another, unsettled by the fact that for the first time, they were not in control. The cubs' wide eyes reflected a new light, something like hope, something they had never dared to feel here. The silence that followed was louder than the crack of any whip, and in that silence, everyone in the room realized that the human's voice had become stronger than fear itself. The words still lingered in the air like a heavy echo, and for a moment it felt as though time itself had stopped. The instructors stood frozen, their arms raised but unmoving, the whips dangling just inches from striking. Their sharp eyes flickered with confusion, as if their bodies no longer belonged to them. They had expected resistance, perhaps begging or pleading, but never this. A single command had stripped their authority from them, and they did not know how to respond. The cubs, who had been trembling and cowering moments before, now dared to lift their heads. Fear was still in their eyes, but it was no longer alone. Something else had joined it, fragile but alive. Hope. The silence of the chamber was heavier than the sound of the whips had been. Every heartbeat, every shallow breath seemed to thunder in the stillness. The human did not move forward, did not raise their hands, yet their presence filled the entire space, forcing everyone to feel the weight of their stance. The instructors exchanged glances, but none dared to break the spell. They had ruled through fear, through pain, through dominance, yet in this moment all of that power slipped from their grasp. The cubs' small bodies leaned closer together, eyes fixed on the human who had changed everything with a single word. In their minds, something shifted, the belief that maybe they were not alone, maybe cruelty was not the only future waiting for them. The human's calm face gave no sign of weakness, only resolve, and that quiet strength held the room captive. The instructor's hands shook, their whips heavy now, as if the air itself refused to let them fall. What once seemed unbreakable, the cycle of harsh training and blind obedience, now stood on the edge of collapse. It wasn't the sharpness of the sound or the force of anger that had stopped the instructors in their tracks. It was something far deeper. The human's voice had carried a weight that could not be ignored, a quiet command that spoke of years of discipline, of battles faced, of a spirit forged through trials no one in that room could see, but all could somehow feel. The authority in that voice was not loud, not cruel, but steady, unshakable, and filled with truth. It pressed down on the room like an invisible force, stronger than the whips, stronger than the fear the instructors had once inspired. The instructors shifted uneasily, realizing they were no longer in control. Their usual dominance stripped away not by defiance, but by a calm certainty that exposed their methods for what they were, empty shows of power. The cubs sensed it too, their wide eyes reflecting something new. They had been taught to bow their heads, to believe pain was the only language of strength. But now they were hearing another language entirely, one that spoke of discipline without cruelty, guidance without fear, and strength without violence. The silence stretched on, heavy and unbroken, every second reminding the instructors that they had been overpowered not by weapons, not by rebellion, but by the undeniable authority of truth. For the first time, the cubs were not shrinking from the whips. They were watching the human with a kind of quiet awe, feeling that maybe this was what true strength looked like. The instructors could sense the shift in the air, the way respect was moving away from them and settling firmly on the figure who had spoken. That weight, carried in just a single word, was enough to turn the balance of the room upside down. The room remained tense, the echoes of the human's single word still vibrating in the air, and the alien instructors found themselves paralyzed by a feeling they had never expected. Low murmurs began to spread among them, whispers filled with disbelief and unease, as each one glanced at the others, searching for understanding. for some explanation that could make sense of what had just occurred. They had spent countless cycles, years even, mastering the art of control over the predator cubs, believing firmly that fear, intimidation, and relentless punishment were the only ways to command respect and obedience. Every whip raised, every harsh command shouted had been part of their carefully honed system, and yet here was one human, quiet and composed, who had done what they thought impossible. One simple word, spoken calmly but with unshakable authority, had stopped their strikes mid-air and held the cubs' attention like a magnet. Questions gnawed at their minds, unsettling the foundations of everything they had believed. How could this human, who had no experience in their harsh methods, inspire obedience where their own years of rigorous training had only created tension and fear? Doubt, that unfamiliar and unwelcome companion, began to creep into their thoughts. Some tried to dismiss it, blaming luck, timing, or even the cub's own temperament, but each failed attempt to rationalize only deepened the unease. They had prided themselves on absolute control, on the certainty that their methods were unbreakable, yet the undeniable truth stared them in the face. Strength was not always measured in volume or pain, and authority could be claimed through calm resolve, unwavering confidence, and the quiet power of conviction. Their pride bristled against the realization, but even as they struggled internally, they could not deny what had happened. The human had shifted the balance, and in that moment, the instructor's doubt was as palpable as the silence that now hung over the training chamber, heavy, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. The room that had once thrummed with tension now carried a different energy altogether, one that was quieter, but far more powerful. The predator cubs, once trembling and frantic under the harsh glares and raised whips of their instructors, now stared with glowing eyes that reflected a new kind of awareness. No longer did they shrink back, huddle into corners, or dart their glances nervously at every movement. Instead, their eyes followed the human with steady attention, shining with a mix of curiosity and cautious respect, as if they were slowly realizing that strength could exist without cruelty. Every twitch of their ears, every small movement of their limbs seemed to show that they were learning, absorbing the calm authority that the human carried. The air in the enclosure felt lighter, and even the distant clanging and echoing of the training equipment seemed less intimidating. The human moved slowly, deliberately, careful not to startle the young predators, yet exuding confidence and control in every step. Each cub mirrored the focus, their eyes never leaving the human, as though silently acknowledging a new order, one built on presence, patience, and quiet command rather than fear and pain. The instructors, meanwhile, stood frozen, watching as the creatures they had once thought to break with force now responded to something far more subtle, yet far more effective. The realization rippled through the room. Respect had replaced terror, and a single human had changed the dynamic of the entire training chamber without raising a hand. Every cub's gaze, fixed and luminous, told the story of lessons learned not through punishment, but through calm, steady guidance. In that moment, it became clear that the bond between human and creature was shifting, a silent understanding forming, one that spoke of trust earned, boundaries recognized, and authority established not through fear, but through patience, composure, and unwavering presence. The glowing eyes, once symbols of panic, had now become mirrors of respect, acknowledgement, and a cautious willingness to follow. The tension in the training chamber was thick, heavier than it had ever been, as if every heartbeat and breath was amplified in the silent anticipation of what would happen next. The predator cubs, now calmer but still alert, watched every movement with eyes that glowed like tiny lanterns in the dim light. Their ears twitched at every sound, and their bodies shifted slightly, ready to react but clearly influenced by the human's steady presence. Suddenly, one of the alien instructors, unable to accept the change and feeling a sting to their authority, raised a whip once more, testing the human's control. The sound of the leather snapping through the air cut sharply across the room, echoing off the metallic walls, and for a moment, everyone, cubs and instructors alike, held their breath. The human, however, did not flinch or move backward. Instead, with unwavering calm and the same measured tone that had commanded attention before, A single word rolled from their lips. It carried a weight that seemed to press against the very air, firm yet controlled, and it reached the ears of everyone in the chamber. The instructor's arm, mid-swing, froze as though caught in invisible chains. The whip stopped just short of striking, trembling in hesitation, and then slowly fell to the side. In that moment, the balance of power shifted noticeably. The cubs, who had witnessed years of fear and aggression, now understood that true authority came from composure and command, not from fear and punishment. Even the other instructors, who had been enforcing strict rules with harshness, felt the ripple of change, sensing that the human's presence alone was enough to influence not just the cubs, but the dynamics of the entire room. The human's gaze swept calmly across the chamber, reinforcing the silent lesson that patience, control, and unwavering resolve could accomplish what whips and intimidation never could. The power had subtly but unmistakably shifted, and the room seemed to exhale as the cubs and instructors alike registered a new reality. One where respect was earned through strength of character, not the strike of a weapon, and where a single steady voice could alter the course of an entire training program. The room, once filled with the harsh echoes of whips and sharp commands, now held a silence that felt almost alive. Every eye, cubs and instructors alike, was fixed on the human, who stood calmly, radiating a quiet authority that needed no threat or display of force. The predator cubs, who had trembled and flinched at every strike and shouted order, now crouched with attentive stillness, their glowing eyes softening from fear to curiosity and cautious respect. Even the alien instructors, who had ruled the training chamber with relentless discipline and cold precision, seemed unsure of how to proceed. Their whips hung uselessly at their sides. Movements paused mid-air, as if the very walls of the hall were waiting for someone to break the spell. For the first time, training had stopped, not because someone had been physically overpowered, but because someone had chosen compassion over cruelty. The human's calm presence created an unspoken understanding that true authority did not require domination, that control could be exercised through patience and care rather than intimidation. The tension that had gripped every corner of the chamber began to dissolve, replaced by a cautious awe. Even the whispers of doubt and challenge that had floated among the instructors earlier faded into thoughtful silence. The cubs tilted their heads, sensing a new possibility, that guidance could come without fear, that respect could be given willingly rather than demanded through pain. Every subtle movement of the human, from a slow step to a gentle gesture, reinforced the lesson. The air itself seemed to shift, carrying the unspoken message that empathy could hold power equal to, if not greater than, the sharpness of a whip. In that moment, the human had done more than halt cruelty. They had shown the entire room a new way forward. Silence stretched long and meaningful across the hall, leaving everyone present to reflect on the rare and transformative force of controlled compassion. The weight of this choice, this quiet defiance against harshness, marked the beginning of a shift that would be remembered in the training halls for years to come. A demonstration of how one human could change the energy of an entire room with nothing more than heart and presence. The air in the training chamber had changed completely. The predator cubs, who had been trembling and shrinking at every harsh command, now began to move closer to the human. Their glowing eyes, once wide with fear, now reflected curiosity and a cautious sense of trust. Each step they took was careful, as if testing whether the calm presence in front of them was truly safe. The human remained still, patient, and deliberate, allowing the cubs to approach at their own pace, never forcing interaction but showing through posture and presence that protection, not harm, was offered. The energy in the room shifted further as the instructors, who had been quick to mock or challenge the human earlier, could no longer ignore the quiet authority being displayed. Their expressions softened, some folding their arms in thought, others pausing mid-motion, realizing that the human's power was not in aggression or loud commands, but in patience, confidence, and control over their own fear. The cubs sniffed and circled, cautiously brushing closer to the human, learning through instinct and observation that this presence was different. The human's calm, firm demeanor acted as a shield, creating a space where trust could grow. Even the cubs' small, instinctive growls now carried more curiosity than threat. The instructors, used to enforcing obedience through harsh methods, found themselves studying the human silently, recognizing a strength that did not rely on intimidation. For the first time, respect in the chamber was earned through demonstration of restraint, courage, and empathy rather than through fear. The cubs huddled nearer, seeking guidance and protection instead of reacting out of panic. The humans' actions, simple yet deliberate, had reshaped the dynamic entirely, proving that authority and influence could be established through understanding and care. What had begun as a tense, fearful training session had transformed into a scene of mutual respect, leaving both the cubs and the instructors to witness how true leadership and compassion could command attention, loyalty and reverence without a single act of cruelty. The chamber that had once echoed with the sharp crack of whips was now filled with a different energy, one of quiet attention and careful observation. The human stood calmly among the predator cubs, who no longer flinched at movement or noise, their glowing eyes focused with curiosity and a budding sense of trust. Every step, every slight gesture of the human was deliberate, showing that authority could be established through patience and understanding rather than through fear and pain. The instructors, who had relied on harsh methods and intimidation to control the cubs, began to realize that the old ways were not the only ways to teach or lead. The human's presence alone demonstrated a principle that words, actions, and calm intent could achieve what whips and shouts never could. Each motion was measured, each glance communicated reassurance, guiding the cubs without forcing obedience. Slowly, the cubs began to mirror this calm confidence, testing boundaries gently and responding with gestures that suggested trust rather than defiance. Even the instructors, who had been quick to criticize or scoff, felt the lesson in the air. True strength lies not in domination but in guidance, not in fear but in respect. The human's eyes, steady and patient, met the glowing eyes of the cubs, creating a silent dialogue where understanding replaced instinctive terror. In that moment, everyone in the chamber understood that leadership and authority could be rooted in care, courage, and clear intent rather than cruelty. The cubs learned that following someone who commanded respect through empathy was far more powerful than obeying out of fear. The human's quiet example reshaped the room entirely, turning what had been a place of punishment into a place of learning and growth. It became clear that the most profound lessons extended far beyond physical punishment. They existed in demonstration, in consistent patience, and in the unwavering belief that guidance and compassion could forge loyalty, courage, and respect where violence had only created resistance and fear. The story of that extraordinary day did not stay confined to the walls of the training hall. It spread rapidly throughout the entire station, carried on whispers, hurried conversations, and even the occasional excited murmur between new arrivals and seasoned crew. Every corner seemed to hold someone retelling the moment when a single human, calm and resolute, had stepped into the center of what was supposed to be a harsh, fear-driven training session and, with just one word, had stopped the cruelty in its tracks. People spoke not only of the courage it took to confront the alien instructors, whose years of authority had made them almost untouchable, but also of the quiet, unwavering strength that had commanded respect without raising a voice or resorting to violence. The predator cubs, once trembling and shrinking under the blows of whips, now lingered near the human with cautious trust, a living testament to the power of patience, understanding, and compassionate authority. Crew members who had previously accepted harsh training methods without question began to see a different way, realizing that true leadership was not about enforcing fear, but about guiding with empathy, intelligence, and unwavering moral presence. Across the station, instructors who had once mocked the human now carried a subtle, reluctant respect, reflecting on the lesson that authority paired with understanding could achieve far more than dominance paired with cruelty. The story reached far beyond the station, inspiring discussions about the human capacity for courage and wisdom in the face of danger, and serving as a reminder that one act of integrity could influence an entire system. For weeks, anyone passing by the training halls would hear references to the incident, and the human who had dared to speak a single word became a legend, a symbol of leadership, a figure whose example encouraged others to act with bravery, fairness, and calm confidence. In the end, the tale of that day endured not just as a story about predator cubs or alien instructors, but as a timeless reminder that true authority and influence arise from respect, patience, and the courage to stand firmly for what is right.